Drake Harrison had tracked fugitives across 5 star systems, but he'd never seen anyone move like this. The figure ahead wore an ornate metallic helmet that caught the light of the twin moons, moving through the rocky terrain of Kingleton Basin with a predator's grace. When their eyes finally met across the narrow ridge, something shifted in Drake's chest. Not fear, but recognition of an equal. He didn't know yet that in less than an hour everything he believed about strength would shatter like glass. He didn't know the face behind that helmet would haunt him for reasons he couldn't name. And he certainly didn't know that the warrior he was about to fight would become the only person who truly understood him. 3 days earlier, Drake had been sitting in a cramped office that smelled of synthetic leather and ozone when the Colonial Mining Corporation made him an offer. A masked raider had been intercepting supply ships heading toward the new mining operations. No one had been hurt yet, but valuable cargo was vanishing. Food, medicine, equipment. The attacks were strategic, planned, executed with military precision. They wanted Drake to track down this ghost and bring them back. Dead or alive, they said, though the way they said it suggested they preferred dead. The corporation's representative, a thin man named Wendell Bright, had slid the contract across the desk with practiced indifference. 10,000 credits now. 20 more when you bring proof the raider's been neutralized. Drake took the job because he needed the money, because tracking was what he did, because sitting still made his skin crawl. He didn't take it because he cared about the corporation or their supplies. He took it because movement was better than stillness, and the frontier was the only place he felt like himself. 1 week, Bright had said. After that, the offer expires. The trail led him northwest into territory that had been Liani land before the treaties that weren't worth the data chips they were stored on. Drake knew these lands were being squeezed, that the wolf-like Liani people who'd lived here for generations were being pushed into smaller and smaller territories as human mining operations expanded. But that wasn't his problem. His problem was following iron trails and disturbed terrain patterns, reading the story the land told him. The raider was careful, skilled, covering their tracks in ways that showed military training. But everyone made mistakes eventually. Everyone left traces. On the second day, Drake found a temporary camp in a rocky outcrop. The heat signature was faint but not ancient. Whoever this was, they were alone. No backup, no support, just one person against an entire system of corporate ships and armed guards. It was either bravery or desperation. Drake couldn't tell which. By the third day, he was close enough to observe them. The figure moved like water over stone, fluid and certain. They wore modified Liani battle gear adapted for stealth operations, lightweight, practical, designed for speed and silence. But it was the helmet that caught his attention, not standard-issue military. This was ancient, ceremonial, crafted from a silvery metal with intricate engravings that seemed to shift in the light. It covered the entire face with narrow slits for the eyes. It wasn't decorative. It was armor, protection, anonymity. Drake watched from a distance as the raider circled a supply transport that had stopped for engine maintenance. The guards never saw them coming. One moment the terrain was empty, the next the masked figure was among them, moving with brutal efficiency. No wasted motion, no hesitation. In less than 2 minutes, 3 guards were on the ground, stunned but alive. The raider took only what could be carried: medical supplies, food concentrates, power cells, and vanished back into the rocks before anyone could react. Drake made his decision then. He wouldn't wait for another attack. He'd force the confrontation on his terms. He knew this terrain well enough to predict the raiders' escape route. There was a narrow ridge ahead, barely wide enough for someone to cross. That's where he'd make his stand. He arrived first, positioned himself behind a boulder and waited. The larger of the 2 moons was beginning its descent when he heard the soft footfalls, steady, unhurried, confident. The raider appeared at the far end of the ridge, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Drake could feel his heartbeat in his throat. This was different from tracking smugglers or bail jumpers. This felt personal in a way he didn't understand. The masked figure stopped, head tilting slightly as they scanned the area. Every movement was controlled, measured. They stood perhaps 30 yards apart, the steep drop-offs on either side of the narrow ridge making escape difficult. Drake stepped out from behind the boulder. "You've been making trouble for people who don't take kindly to it." His voice echoed off the rocky walls. The masked warrior tilted their head slightly, studying him. When they spoke, the voice was muffled by the helmet but clear enough. "Trouble is taking what doesn't belong to you. I'm just taking it back." The voice was not what Drake expected, higher than a man's but not feminine in any delicate way. Strong, certain. He felt something shift in his perception, but the helmet revealed nothing. "You're one person against a corporate security force with military-grade weapons. That's not taking it back. That's choosing to die." Drake kept his hand near his stunner, not drawing it yet. The warrior moved their hand to the blade at their side. "Maybe, but I won't die quietly." What happened next came fast and brutal. The warrior closed the distance between them with shocking speed, blade flashing in the moonlight. Drake barely got his own knife up in time to deflect the strike. The impact sent shock waves up his arm. This wasn't some amateur playing at rebellion. This was someone who'd been trained to kill. They circled each other in the narrow space, dust rising around their feet. Drake had size and reach, but the warrior had speed and precision. Every attack Drake launched was deflected or avoided. Every opening he thought he saw closed before he could exploit it. They fought in silence except for the rasp of breath and the scrape of boots on stone. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Drake's muscles burned. Sweat stung his eyes. The warrior showed no signs of slowing. Then Drake saw his chance. The warrior overextended slightly on a thrust, and Drake grabbed their wrist, twisting hard. He used his weight to force them down, and they went to the ground together in a tangle of limbs. Drake ended up on top, his hand pinning the warrior's knife arm. They struggled beneath him, fierce and desperate. He could feel the heat of their body through the layers of clothing, could hear their breathing, harsh and ragged. For a moment they were so close he could see his own reflection in the polished helmet. Then the warrior went still, not surrendering but calculating. Drake reached up with his free hand and pulled the helmet away. The face that looked up at him stole the breath from his lungs. Amber eyes that blazed with fury and something else he couldn't name. High cheekbones covered in a fine layer of silver-gray fur. A strong jawline that tapered to a slightly elongated muzzle. Black-tipped ears that now lay flat against her head. Not human, a Liani, a female Liani warrior. Drake froze completely. His grip loosened without him meaning it to. She used that moment to twist her hips and throw him off balance, revering their positions in one fluid motion. Suddenly she was on top of him, knife pressed against his throat. Her face was inches from his, those amber eyes boring into him. He could feel her breath on his face, could smell pine and smoke and something wild he couldn't name. Neither of them moved. The blade was cold against his skin. One push and she could end this. But she didn't. She stared down at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Her chest heaved with exertion, her silver-streaked dark hair falling around her face, partially obscuring her lupin features. Drake's heart hammered for reasons that had nothing to do with the knife. Time seemed to stop. The ridge, the moons, the dust settling around them, all of it faded until there was only her face above his and the weight of her body pinning him down. Then she spoke, and her voice was different without the helmet. Raw, real. "You saw my face." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, an acknowledgement of something that couldn't be undone. Drake swallowed carefully against the blade. "I did." She pressed the knife fractionally harder. "Then you know what I have to do." But she didn't move, didn't follow through. They stayed frozen in that impossible moment, the question hanging between them. What happens now? And that's when they heard it, the sound that would change everything. The low hum of approaching transport engines. Multiple vehicles coming fast from the direction Drake had come. The corporation security forces had tracked him tracking her, and they were seconds away from finding both of them on this ridge with nowhere to run. The Liani looked toward the sound, then back at Drake, and he saw the calculation in her eyes turn to something else, something like desperation. She made a decision. Instead of cutting his throat, she grabbed his collar and hauled him to his feet with surprising strength. "Run!" It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Drake stared at her, confused. She just tried to kill him. Now she was trying to save him. Before he could ask why, she was moving, pulling him toward a narrow crevice in the rock wall he hadn't noticed before. The engine sounds were getting louder. The guards would round the corner any second. Drake had a choice to make, and he had maybe 3 seconds to make it. He ran. The crack in the rock wall was barely wide enough for one person, let alone two. The Liani went first, moving sideways through the narrow gap with practiced ease. Drake followed, his shoulders scraping against stone. Behind them, the shouts of the guards echoed off the canyon walls. They'd found the abandoned gear. They'd find the tracks next. The gap opened into a small cave, barely tall enough to stand in. The Liani moved to the back where the darkness was thickest, and Drake followed. They pressed themselves against the cold stone, close enough that he could feel the rise and fall of her breathing. Neither spoke. Speaking would give them away. The guards' voices grew louder. Drake could hear individual words now. "Trail splits here. Check that gap. Too narrow for a hover bike, but a person could fit." Footsteps approached the entrance to their hiding spot. Drake held his breath. The Liani's hand moved to her blade, slow and silent. A shadow fell across the cave entrance, and Drake could see the outline of a guard peering into the darkness. The guard stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then another voice called out from farther away. "Found fresh tracks heading north. They went up the ridge." The shadow at the entrance hesitated, then moved away. The footsteps receded. The voices faded, but still neither Drake nor the Liani moved. They waited in the darkness, listening until the only sound was their own breathing and the distant cry of some native avian creature. When the Liani finally moved, it was to check the cave entrance. She looked out carefully, scanning the area in both directions. Then she turned back to Drake, and in the dim light filtering into the cave, he could see her face clearly for the first time. She was younger than he'd thought during the fight, mid-20s maybe, but her eyes held the kind of weight that came from seeing too much too soon. Silver-gray fur covered most of her face, darkening to black around her muzzle and ears. A thin scar ran from just above her left eye down to her cheek. She studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away, but he held her gaze. Finally she spoke, "You should have turned me in." Her voice was low, barely above a whisper. Drake leaned against the cave wall. "Probably. But you didn't." "No," she tilted her head slightly, ears perking up. "Why?" It was a good question. Drake wasn't sure he had a good answer. He'd spent 3 days tracking her down, had taken money to bring her back dead or alive. And when the moment came to do exactly that, he'd run with her instead. "You could have killed me," he said instead of answering. "You had the blade at my throat, but you didn't." The Liani's jaw tightened. "That's different." "How?" "Because I'm not a killer." Drake almost laughed at that. "You disabled 3 guards 2 hours ago." "Disabled, not killed. There's a difference." She moved away from the entrance, back toward where he stood. The cave wasn't large. When she stopped, she was close enough that he could see the individual silver hairs that framed her face. "I take what my people need to survive. I don't take lives unless I have no choice." Drake studied her face in the half-light. The fierce warrior who'd nearly bested him in combat. The woman who'd saved him instead of letting the guards find them both. "Your people," he said. "The mining operations are on their land." It wasn't a question. The Liani's eyes flashed with something between anger and pain. "Our land, yes. The land where my father was born, where his father was born, going back generations. The land that was promised to us in treaties your government signed and then ignored the moment they found something they wanted more. Her voice was controlled, but Drake could hear the fury underneath. So I take back what I can. Food, medicine, supplies they stole from us by stealing our land. Drake had no defense for that. He'd seen enough of the frontier territories to know the treaties were worthless. That promises made to native species were broken as fast as they were made. That the corporations came and took and never considered what they were taking from. The guards will come back, Drake said. When they realize the tracks are a false trail, they'll come back here. The Liani nodded. We need to move after dark. She fixed him with those amber eyes. You ran with me. That makes you a traitor in their eyes, same as me. Drake knew she was right. The moment he'd followed her into this cave instead of turning her over to the guards, he'd made his choice. There was no going back to the corporation, no collecting his payment, no returning to the life he'd had 3 days ago. He'd burned that bridge without even realizing he was holding the match. Where will you go? He asked. The Liani was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. There's a place in the northern mountains where my people are gathering, but it's 3 days' journey and we'd have to cross territory where every outpost has a description of me. She paused, measuring him. I can't do it alone. The implication hung in the air between them. She was asking for his help, or maybe not asking, maybe just stating a fact. Either way, Drake understood what she was offering. A purpose, a direction, something that mattered more than tracking bounties for money. He should have said no, should have waited for darkness and slipped away, disappeared into the frontier where no one would find him. But when he opened his mouth, different words came out. 3 days is a long time to travel with someone whose name you don't know. Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile but close. Lyra Silvermane. Drake Harrison. They stood in the darkness of the cave, 2 people who should have been enemies, bound together now by circumstances neither had chosen. Outside, the larger moon was setting. Soon it would be dark enough to move. But for now they waited in the quiet, and Drake wondered what he'd just committed himself to. The sound came without warning, a low rumble that grew steadily louder. Both of them moved to the cave entrance. In the distance, dust rose from the rocky terrain. More vehicles, at least a dozen, maybe more. Not the security guards from before. These were moving with military precision, spread out in a search pattern. Someone had brought reinforcements. Someone wanted Lyra badly enough to commit serious resources. Drake felt her tense beside him. They're not going to stop, she said quietly. Not until they find me. Drake looked at the vehicles, then at her. Then we make sure they don't. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. There were 2 people on foot trapped in a canyon with limited exits, facing a dozen armed corporate mercenaries who knew this area as well as he did. The odds weren't good. The odds were terrible, and night was still an hour away. The vehicles spread out across the terrain like a net closing. Drake counted 13 vehicles, all armed, moving with the kind of coordination that spoke of military training or worse. Lyra watched them from the cave entrance, her body coiled tight as a spring. Drake could see her calculating distances, angles, possibilities. None of them good. There's another way out, she said finally. Through the back of the cave, it's narrow, we'd have to crawl. Drake looked into the darkness at the rear of the cave. He couldn't see anything that looked like an exit. How narrow? Narrow enough that you might not fit. She turned to face him and her expression was unreadable. I can make it. You'd be taking a chance. Below them, the corporate forces were dismounting, preparing to search on foot. They had maybe 10 minutes before someone thought to check the narrow gap in the canyon wall. Drake made his decision. Show me. Lyra moved to the back of the cave where the shadows were deepest. She knelt down and felt along the base of the wall until her hands found what she was looking for. A gap maybe 2 feet high and 3 feet wide, barely visible in the darkness. It opens up after about 20 feet, she said. Comes out on the other side of the ridge, but you have to go through the tight section first. Drake knelt beside her. The opening looked impossibly small. He was broader through the shoulders than most humans. If he got stuck halfway through, he'd be trapped helpless. But staying here meant capture or worse. He looked at Lyra, found her watching him with those amber eyes. "You first," he said. "I'll follow." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Without another word, she dropped to her stomach and slid into the gap. Drake watched her feet disappear into the darkness. He counted to 10, giving her time to get ahead, then followed. The moment he entered the passage, he understood what she'd meant. The stone pressed against his shoulders on both sides. His back scraped against the ceiling. He had to exhale completely just to move forward. Panic touched the edges of his mind. He pushed it away. Focus on what's ahead. He could hear the soft sounds of Lyra moving through the darkness. He focused on that, on following her, on the promise that it opened up ahead. The passage seemed to go on forever. His shoulders ached from holding them at an angle. His elbows were raw from dragging himself forward. Sweat ran into his eyes. Then suddenly the pressure eased. The passage widened. He could lift his head, could move his arms more freely. Relief flooded through him. A hand grabbed his wrist in the darkness. Lyra pulling him forward. "Almost there," she whispered. "Keep moving." Drake pulled himself along, following her touch until suddenly there was space around him. Air. He could stand. Dim light filtered down from above. They were in a vertical shaft, maybe 15 feet deep, with handholds carved into the stone. Lyra was already climbing. Drake followed, his muscles protesting every movement. They emerged on the far side of the ridge, hidden from the canyon by a tumble of massive boulders. The sun had finally set. Twilight painted everything in shades of blue and gray. Lyra moved immediately to check their surroundings, and Drake realized how practiced these movements were. She'd done this before, used this escape route, prepared for exactly this situation. "How far do your people?" Drake asked quietly. Lyra pointed northeast. 2 days if we push hard, 3 if we're careful. She turned to face him. And between here and there, 5 outposts, multiple security checkpoints, territory where anyone who sees me will report it. She paused. And now they'll be looking for you too. The guards saw you. They know you helped me escape. Drake nodded. He'd known that the moment he'd made his choice in the canyon. Then we travel at night, stay off the main trails. Lyra studied him. "You know this territory." "I've tracked through most of it, that's why they hired me." It wasn't a question. Drake met her gaze. "Yes." For a long moment they stood facing each other in the fading light. 2 people from different worlds thrown together by violence and choice, and something neither of them fully understood yet. Then Lyra did something unexpected. She reached up and touched the side of his face where a cut from the earlier fight had dried. Her fingers were gentle, careful. Drake went completely still. The touch lasted only a moment, but it sent heat through his entire body. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. "It's nothing. It will get infected if you don't clean it." She pulled her hand back, but something in her eyes had changed, softened. "There's a stream half a mile from here. We can clean up, fill our canteens, then move." Drake nodded, not trusting his voice. The place where she'd touched his face still burned. They moved through the twilight in silence, Lyra leading the way with the confidence of someone who knew every rock and tree. Drake followed, watching the way she moved, the way she checked behind them every few minutes, the way she seemed to read the landscape like he read tracks. She was magnificent, dangerous, and completely self-sufficient. It should have put him on edge. Instead, it drew him in. The stream was exactly where she'd said it would be, a thin ribbon of clear water running between smooth stones. They knelt on opposite sides, washing the dust and blood from their faces and hands. Drake watched her across the water. She'd removed the outer layer of her clothing, revealing arms covered in the same silver-gray fur as her face, marked with small scars, evidence of a life lived hard. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" Nothing, Drake said, but it wasn't nothing. It was everything. The way the last light caught in her fur, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her hands as she cupped water to her face. Lyra finished washing and sat back on her heels. We should rest here for an hour. Let full dark come before we move. Drake agreed. They settled on opposite sides of a large boulder, hidden from view but able to watch the approaches. For a while, neither spoke. Then Lyra's voice came from the darkness. "Why did you really run with me?" Drake thought about lying, thought about giving her an answer that was safe and easy. But something about the darkness and the sound of the water made him tell the truth. "Because when I saw your face, everything changed. Everything I thought I was doing, everything I thought I knew, it all became meaningless." Silence, then so quietly he almost missed it. "I know the feeling." Drake turned his head, trying to see her in the darkness. "What do you mean?" "When you could have let the guards find me, but you didn't. When you chose to run instead of turning me in." She paused. "No one has ever chosen me over their own safety before." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Drake wanted to move closer to see her face, to understand what he heard in her voice. But before he could, a sound froze them both. Voices, coming from the direction they'd come. The corporate forces had found the escape tunnel. They were on this side of the ridge, and they were getting closer. Lyra moved first, silent as smoke. She grabbed Drake's arm and pulled him away from the boulder, deeper into the brush that lined the stream. They dropped flat against the ground, hidden beneath a tangle of low branches. Drake could feel the dampness of the earth soaking through his shirt. Lyra pressed against his side, close enough that he could feel her heartbeat, fast but steady, controlled. The voices grew louder. 3 men, maybe 4, moving along the ridge. "Trail goes cold here. Check the stream. They might have stopped for water." Footsteps approached. Drake could see boots through gaps in the brush, no more than 10 feet away. He felt Lyra's hand grip his arm, warning him to stay still. One of the men knelt at the stream's edge, cupping water to his mouth. If he looked up, if he glanced their direction, it was over. The man drank, then stood. "Nothing here," they kept moving. Another voice further away. "We're losing light, can't track in the dark." "Director Bright wants them found, both of them." "Director Bright can want all he likes. I'm not breaking my neck stumbling around these rocks at night. We camp here, pick up the trail at first light." Drake felt Lyra tense beside him. If the men camped here, they'd be trapped. No way to move without being seen or heard. But the first voice spoke again. "Not here, too exposed. There's better ground half a mile south. Trees for cover, flat ground for sleep pods, and further from where we lost the trail. They're heading northeast. Everyone knows that. We'll catch them tomorrow when they have to cross the valley." The voices began to fade as the men moved away. Drake and Lyra stayed frozen until the sound of footsteps disappeared completely. Even then, they waited. Minutes passed. The darkness deepened. Finally, Lyra lifted her head slightly, listening. Then she moved, pulling Drake up with her. "We can't go northeast," she whispered. "They'll be waiting." Drake nodded. "South is blocked by the camp. West goes back toward the outposts. That leaves north through the high passes." Drake knew those passes, steep, treacherous even in daylight. At night, one wrong step could mean a fatal fall. That's suicide. Lyra's eyes met his in the darkness. "It's survival. They won't expect it, won't follow us there at night." She was right, but that didn't make it less dangerous. Drake looked at the dark shapes of the mountains rising to the north. Then he looked at her face, barely visible in the starlight. The determination there, the refusal to give up. "How well do you know those passes?" he asked. "Well enough." It wasn't the reassurance he'd hoped for, but it was all they had. "Then we go north." They moved through the darkness with painful slowness. Every step had to be tested, every handhold checked before trusting weight to it. The ground rose steadily, becoming rockier, steeper. Drake's legs burned from the constant climbing. His hands were raw from gripping stone. Ahead of him, Lyra moved with remarkable sureness, finding paths he couldn't see. Twice she stopped him just before he would have stepped into empty air. She seemed to navigate as much by feel as by sight, reading the mountain through her feet and hands. Hours passed, the air grew colder, Drake's breath came in visible puffs. They were high now, higher than he'd realized. The stars seemed close enough to touch. Lyra stopped at a narrow ledge and turned back to help him up. Her hand gripped his with surprising strength. When he reached the ledge beside her, she didn't immediately let go. "There's a shelf ahead," she said quietly. "Wide enough to rest. We need to stop before we make a mistake." Drake agreed. They were both exhausted, running on nothing but determination. The shelf was exactly as she described. A flat section of rock protected by an overhang, hidden from view from above or below. They collapsed onto it, backs against the stone, breathing hard. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Drake felt Lyra shiver beside him. The temperature had dropped significantly. They were exposed on the mountain with no fire, no shelter other than the overhang. "You're cold," Drake said. "I'm fine," but she shivered again, betraying the lie. Drake made a decision. He moved closer and put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. She stiffened for a moment, then gradually relaxed into the warmth. "This doesn't mean anything," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Of course not," Drake replied, but they both knew it did. They sat like that as the night deepened around them. Drake could feel every point where their bodies touched, her shoulder against his chest, her head resting just below his chin, the steady rhythm of her breathing. It should have been awkward. Instead, it felt natural, necessary. "Tell me about your people," Drake said quietly. Lyra was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she began to speak. "We were promised autonomy, peace, a place to live without interference. Those promises lasted exactly as long as it took for someone to discover the mineral deposits under our hunting grounds." Her voice was steady, but Drake could hear the pain beneath. "My father tried to fight through their courts, through their laws. He believed if we followed the proper channels, they'd honor their word. He died still believing that." "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring him back, doesn't return our land, doesn't feed the children or heal the sick." She pulled away slightly to look up at him. "That's why I take what I can, because waiting for justice means watching people starve." Drake had no answer for that. No defense. He'd seen enough of the frontier to know she was right, that the system was built to take from people like her and give to people like the corporations he'd been working for. "What about you?" Lyra asked. "Why do you live like you do, always moving, never staying?" Drake considered lying, considered giving her some easy answer, but the darkness and the cold and the warmth of her body against his loosened something in him. "Because staying means being known. Being known means being expected to be someone. I've never been good at being who people expect." "What are you good at?" He smiled without humor, leaving before anyone can be disappointed. Lyra turned to look at him fully. Their faces were inches apart. "Is that what you're planning, to leave?" Drake met her eyes. "I don't know." "That's honest at least." She held his gaze for another moment, then settled back against him. But something had shifted. Some barrier had thinned. They sat together on the mountain shelf. Two people running from different things toward an uncertain future. And Drake realized with sudden clarity that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be simple again. The sound of falling rocks somewhere below them shattered the moment. They were on their feet instantly. Lyra moved to the edge of the shelf, peering down into the darkness. Drake joined her, straining to see or hear anything in the blackness below. Then he saw it, a single point of light, a portable lantern, moving steadily upward. Whoever was climbing wasn't trying to hide. "Just one person," Lyra whispered. "Could be a scout, could be someone who saw us come up here." Drake watched the light bob and weave. as the climber navigated the treacherous path.